So here, the challenge was to summarize everything. Well, the key things we learned about value add during SECLI firm. And the first thing just to say that I think that actually to do or to attempt sort of quantitative economic valuation is actually, well, harder than I think we anticipated. I mean, we started off the process by reviewing the different types of methods available, and then it was quite a long process and a process of dialogue of trying to identify which method was most appropriate for each case study. And then the actual steps of application themselves were quite complex, I think, and at times kind of harder than we thought, thinking about the types of data that were needed. So in fact, in the end, we weren't able to do an economic valuation for all the case studies, but I think two groups of very promising methods emerged. So one is the performance indicators approach that NL used, combined with their econometric modeling approaches. And then the other is this kind of approach to estimating avoided costs using relative economic value that the Met Office used with their industrial partners. And I think we've heard this throughout, I think in every conference session, that forecast skill and value are not the same thing. So for example, we saw some examples last week of where relative economic value indicates some value at longer lead times than you see if you only look at, for example, at the Brier Skills Score. But what's clear, and has come out in the discussions earlier today, that skill is a limiting factor on the value. And across all the case studies, it was clear that there's real kind of practical value in using seasonal forecasts for decision making. Perhaps it might be making kind of more robust or more confident decisions, but also we showed how I think the practical value can be enhanced by how forecasts are presented. So, for example, in forms that fit well with the existing tools and approaches of the user. We had some examples of that in terms of the trial climate services, for example. And then, I mean, just a few minutes ago, we were talking about sub-seasonal forecasts, for example, sort of 5-day forecasts and so on. And for a number of our users, they are certainly interested in this seamless approach with information on different timescales, and even going out in some cases to kind of a year ahead, so melding the forecast eventually with climatology. And the bottom point, I think, really, I mean, it's a different way of thinking about the power of what here I call the kind of narratives and experience of our industrial partners. And I think we were really lucky that people like Ian Savage, for example, who we've kind of heard from today, but there are many others involved in SECLI firm who've kind of really been willing to speak freely. So I call these people champion users or early adopters, and I think their voices are really quite powerful. Okay, the way forward, fairly briefly, I mean, it's a practical level. I think certainly we found that at times the availability of appropriate and confidential economic data was a constraint. And I talked about the practical value of seasonal forecasts. I mean, that came out in rather sort of ad hoc ways. For example, in the survey that Joe talked about earlier. So I think it would be really good to have a more systematic framework for capturing the different aspects of this more practical value. Then as we think about a future and greater market uptake of climate services, maybe we need to think about how that might affect both the value add itself, but also the appropriate assessment methods, particularly if we're thinking about economic methods. Some of the methods, for example, assume that that the kind of decision made has no influence outside the institution. And then my final point really cuts across all those three things, because I don't think you can do those three things without kind of expanding the expertise, taking a more into even transdisciplinary approach to assessment of value add. So certainly bringing in greater economic expertise in decision making, but also behavioural experts as well. So, yep, that's it from SECLI firm. And I should say there are a number of other people online who can maybe help answer questions about the SECLI firm experience. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Claire, for giving us SECLI Fund perspective. Lots of food for thought in your presentation, and we'll take that up later when we come to questions. Right, next up is what pleasure in introducing Joe Osborne. Joe and Katie have been working with Hazel, as you know, on the evaluation of the SECLI project trial climate services. We heard quite a lot from Joe earlier this afternoon as well. So Joe, I'm not sure whether Joe, you presenting it okay, but over to you, Joe.
Yeah, it's me. Thank you. So yes, so sticking on SECLI firm for a little bit, but thinking more about evaluation, and by this evaluation, I mean the component of the project that concerned the actual climate services and what had been developed, and even within that, thinking about the services. So what did we learn? Well, I think we learned that there's actually a lot you can evaluate. So you can evaluate the actual process of code development, for example, the quality and effectiveness of stakeholder engagement, which I think is something that was a real success of SECLI firm and something that we did well. But we kind of pushed that to one side and decided that actually what we were more interested in, what we thought was perhaps most unique about SECLI firm, was the development of the services and the sort of visualizations we were coming up with. So we learned that we needed to refine exactly what we were going to evaluate, and through that process we decided that we were going to evaluate the outputs and outcomes. So specifically thinking about the visualizations that we had come up with, the usability of the sort of visualizations and the services, and just sort of unpicking some of the examples in terms of how the forecast information was being used to make decisions on the part of the user as well, because through that we really got an idea of perhaps where there were gaps in what was being provided, and perhaps where sort of supplementary materials or extra services, perhaps some insights from an operation meteorologist talking around a specific forecast, particularly a specific forecast was where it is beneficial to like an important operation. We decided, we found that that could be extra useful. So we wanted to explore this space really of evaluating the outputs and outcomes. And another thing we learned as well is timely evaluation is probably more important than too much evaluation. We didn't want to overburden the industry partners, the end users, with constant evaluation and actually distracting from the co-production of services. We learned it was important to time that. So we had one iteration of evaluation back in February and March of this year, once the services had already been live for a few months. And we revisited that just in the last month or so to really understand and track the improvements that had been made in that 5 to 6 month period since the first iteration of that evaluation process. So I've already touched on this a little bit, but this is kind of just summarizing kind of what we learned and how we presented this evaluation. So it talks around evaluating outcomes and outputs, and it talks about what we're not doing. So we're not evaluating the skill. So we stripped the skill to one side and just thought about what was being presented and how useful, how user-friendly was it. So in terms of thinking a little bit more in terms of the way forward is very much built upon the sort of feedback we got on our questions that we asked. So those questions were designed around a number of key themes. Those 5 themes are shown here: visualization, usability, user needs, essentially whether it was meeting those needs, the development of the service, and whether we were kind of properly capturing the needs of the end user, and also the future use as well. And this just summarizes kind of what we learned, a kind of way forward here, and perhaps some of the, I guess, key kind of learning from SECLI firm in a way, in terms of what extra is needed to bridge that gap between the sort of research organization, the organization that's developing some quite complex scientific outputs, and the end user who actually need to make some decisions, who need to be confident in making those decisions. And really what we learned is that there was still a bit of a gap there, and there was a need for extra support in making those decisions. For example, I mentioned operational meteorologists earlier. That's something we actually trialed with one of the case studies. In the case study with the partnership between Shell and the Met Office, we trialed that kind of input from an operational meteorologist. In some instances, we heard that a briefing note would be advantageous. And also in other instances, we heard that extra training would be better. I think Ian touched on that earlier when he was talking about the Thames Water example. So as a way forward, we learned that a bit more support and perhaps from an earlier sort of stage in that process would be beneficial. And that's me done.
You actually explained to the whole community very clearly, which has been very useful. And also at the beginning of this project, we talked about the gap between the customer and the reseller. And as you say, you narrowed the gap and suggested some of the things we probably might discuss it later. So thank you very much. Right, without further ado, let's move on to our third speaker. Albert is an environment engineer from Polytechnic of Catalonia, Barcelona. And he is the head of the Earth System Services group of the Earth Science Department at the BSc. So Albert, it's over to you now.
Okay, so can we go to the first slide? Just to introduce what we did in S2S4E. In S2S4E, it was a parallel project to SECLI firm, and in S2S4E, we were working with sub-seasonal and seasonal predictions, so the forecast for the forthcoming 4 weeks and the forthcoming months. And our aim in this project was to do the research, to improve the models, to integrate them with the energy system. And to do so, we decided to go in an operational way, because we wanted to really understand how to use or the potential value of sub-seasonal and seasonal predictions. So we developed the science, so like the backend, and the main result of the project was the DST, a decision support tool that it's available online. You can check it. You have to register, but it's free. It's just to engage with the people that it's using it. And so, as I said, so we combine sub-seasonal and seasonal predictions. Here we can see an image at global scale for temperature. But we were working in different aspects to improve the system. So, for instance, here we have a comparison between the one single prediction from, I think that this is system 5 from the European Center, together with a multi-model using all the seasonal forecasts from Copernicus. And at the same time, we were, next slide, please. At the same time, we were also working and developing different energy indicators to tailor the information for the supply and the demand. So taking all this into account, okay, it was important for us to enhance the interactions with the user and to perform economic assessments. For us, the economic assessment was a way. So we have been in the previous discussions, we had been talking a lot about the skill. But for us, the economic assessment was a way to talk about the skill with the user. So to really define specific decision processes and to evaluate the skill for different, for taking into account different forecasts and different lead times, for instance. Okay, so in summary, we saw that there is a significant interest in sub-seasonal and seasonal predictions, and it has a potential value for many different processes. In S2S4E, as SECLI firm, we were focusing on energy, but many of the results that we get in the end can be replicated in other sectors like agriculture or insurance, for instance. Some ideas that we get and that we want to push forward. So it's the first one is that the climate data store is the European initiative to provide a single point of access to quality assured climate information. At this stage, it has observations, it has reanalysis, it has seasonal predictions, and it has projections, but it doesn't have sub-seasonal predictions. And I think that it will be great to integrate sub-seasonal predictions in Copernicus Copernicus in the climate data store, because at the same time, it will facilitate the involvement of other climate services developers to use the subseasonal predictions and to develop new services. The second one is to further interact with energy companies or NSOE, because subseasonal and seasonal predictions can support the adaptation of the energy system to integrate renewable energies. And taking into account the increase of renewable energies, I think that it's a critical point. The third one, it's something that we cannot forget. So in the last decades, climate predictions, so subseasonal, seasonal, or other timescales have improved a lot. Now we have a scale for certain regions, variables, and lead times, but further research it's also needed. And the fourth point is that we need to promote the development of services consisting along different timescales. In S2S4E, we did an effort putting together subseasonal and seasonal. I think that this is a good starting point, but we cannot forget about other timescales. So like decadal. By the end of the project, we started to work a lot on decadal in other projects and other initiatives, and it has a potential value. For instance, for drought, we saw that we have a lot of skill in southern Europe, and it has impact. So drought predictions has an impact on agriculture, but also on energy. And the fifth point is that, as Sofia is going to talk now about Claim to Power, we need to put together different communities. So it's in the energy community, there are some modelers working with energy models. So we need to foster the integration between the climate data and specific risk-oriented models like energy, but also in terms of crop production for agriculture or whatever. And finally, the last point is to get a better understanding about user needs and to promote ways to engage with them. So we in the last years, we had great opportunities with different Horizon Europe projects, ERA4CS, Copernicus contracts. But we have to go further. We need to really sit with them to really test in the way that they need the information, because it's a way for us to learn how we can do research with an impact, and at the same time it's the way to provide knowledge transfer. And that's all. Thanks.
Is Sofia going to say?
Okay, so if you could just move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, I was asked to be here to tell you a little bit about the Claim to Power project. So this was a project where we are, let's say 80% of us were from the energy world, and we had energy companies on board, but also a lot of energy planners. So we are, just to let you know, we are the type of people that runs energy models, sometimes very long-term ones like 2050, 2060, and sometimes we try to look at the next season. And these types of models, they are used for policy making, for things like, carbon neutrality roadmaps and setting up pathways on how the energy system can transition to a more renewable and less carbon intensive one. And these models have been run for quite some time, at least 20 years now throughout the world, and they've always considered that climate is not going to change. So we've been using average historic years, which we all know that at this moment do not make sense anymore to use. So at the same time where we are modeling increasingly more renewable power systems with a lot more wind and hydro and sun, we were assuming that wind variability, solar and hydro, was not going to change, and it was going to be left at the same thing as previous years. So the goal of Claim to Power was actually to try to make energy models better integrate climate, not only long-term climate change, but also seasonal forecasts. And this was what we have been trying to do. And we have done this for the whole of Europe, and then we zoomed in different regional case studies. Yeah, so I'm not going, of course, to bother you a lot with what we have managed to do. We did develop a series of outputs where we try to show to end users, non-scientific end users, what could be the results of integrating climate data into energy and power models. You can go online and play around with one of them. That's the one you can see on your left hand side. So basically what we've tried to show in this service, the web service we've put online, is how the results for what could be a carbon neutral power sector in Europe change if you consider different climate projections and different seasonal forecasts. The models we run, they are typically focusing on cost minimization. So they try to come up with a combination of technologies that allow you to generate the cheapest possible electricity. And we wanted to see if that combination of cheapest possible electricity generation technologies would change if you consider different types of climate patterns for wind, solar, and hydro variability, and also, of course, how temperature affects the demand. And we wanted to see if this could happen, what would the effect of this in the long term in 2050, and if we consider seasonal forecasts, if the way the power system is operated next season would change. So we did find some modifications, and it was interesting to see that there is in fact a difference in these models that have a lot of uncertainties, that we could identify which regions of Europe are more sensitive to different climate profiles. And we tried to show these, to communicate these in this web service with a number of indicators, like things like the percentage of renewable electricity, how it could change, or the installed capacity for wind and solar, etc. And also we played around a little bit with things like infographics that you can see on your right-hand side, because we had industry end users, but we also had policymakers as end users. And of course, they wanted to have access to nice graphic information that we tried our best to comply with. I'm not sure we succeeded, but at least we did try. So some of the things we have learned, I think I'm showing you the one I've learned the most. So this is basically a cartoon we've produced in the project. And in there, we tried to show how difficult it is actually to communicate and to translate climate language data and energy modeling language. You see there that data track represents climate data. There's a wealth of climate data that climate scientists have available. And you can see there's two people talking. One is a climate scientist, and the other one is an energy modeler. And the climate scientist is really happy providing to the energy modeler all the climate data they have, so the energy modeler can integrate it in its very small energy model, which is represented by that little folder. So I hope this image communicates to you how difficult it is from at least an energy modeling perspective, to make a much more smaller and simpler model as energy models, which are already considered to be very complex if you talk to policymakers and to industry people. But for us to make these models dialogue with the climate data and climate models output was a massive challenge, and I'm not sure we have found the easiest and fastest way to do this. So in terms of what does this mean, for further research? So, well, for sure, it means that it's, of course, really important to consider how climate data and climate projections and forecasts are changing, and to make energy models more sensitive to climate and to different climate variability. But I think we still do not know enough, and we should never underestimate the effort that you need to deal with, to do this in a speedy way. Also, then we enter, this is some of the things we've also experienced with, like, say, follow-ups of Clean to Power, where we enter a kind of a gray area where people actually told us, what you have done is really interesting. Maybe we should, you know, just take this and make it, I don't know, as part of Copernicus, for example. But to do that, we would need to have substantial amounts of work to run energy models. And that's actually not research anymore, but it's also not efficiently commercially appealing to be paid for. So I think one of the things we need to deal with is this gray area where you have a potential product, but that is very time consuming and very expensive to produce, but it's still not commercially appealing enough to be paid for on a market basis. So that's something of interest to discuss and to think about. And I very honestly ask, is it even worth it? Maybe it's then not worth it to have all this work on energy models, and maybe you can use instead things like machine learning. So that's something else we've also explored from Claim to Power. So I think that's it from my side, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have some.
Thank you, Sophia, on the Claim to Power, and thank you, Albert. Very interesting perspective, and we might take up those questions after the last presentation. So we come to the last presentation, and the last presentation is going to be given by Adrian Perales. Adrian is a PhD in Environment and Resource Economics from the University of Amsterdam. So Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm here research professor in FMI, dealing with climate change impacts and the evaluation of climate and weather services in economic sense. I coordinated the EU MAX study, which was about assessing how the climate services market is developing and what are notably what are the obstacles in that development. So it's a bit more cross-cutting, and I don't go deep into particular technical obstacles that were also discussed earlier and options. Next to the things I mentioned here, there are indeed also several kind of matching issues that were mentioned earlier. If you go to the actual concrete usability of particular services, particular users. But if you look to the big things that are really important to get this whole area on the move and much larger amounts of uptake of these services, and also developing the services that are needed, then one issue is that there are many sectors where in fact the obligations or the incentives to understand climate risks and to have climate risk transparency also for the clients again and investors and so on is insufficient, or you think you can roll off the risks to somebody else, which means you don't have so much incentive to deal with that a lot yourself. In particular, relevant are the financial sector, including pension funds, infrastructure organizations, municipalities or regions with all their infrastructure and services they have to take care of, and healthcare. All these, in the meantime, of course, all these sectors have been moving, and infrastructure organizations like energy and road systems have already been moving more, and to some extent municipalities also already. And finance has started, but there is still a lot to win, and it would also help in terms of systematic approaches if there would indeed be obligations and incentives. There is policy developed in that direction ever more. For example, for municipal scans, but also in the financial sector, there are now initiatives going on that are moving in that direction. Another element on the supply side is that still a lot of climate services, and now I'm talking about all climate services, sort of the seasonal climate service and sub-seasonal that we're talking about here, are already in a relative better shape, you would say, because they, in some sense, they're already more concrete and provide answers that have already at least a bit more clearer focus for potential users than the other services still have. But anyhow, a lot of these services are still developed by public or semi-public kind of organizations, which may be very good in having good ideas and developing an idea or a blueprint, but maybe not so good in doing service delivery, which needs again other kind of mentality. So how you cooperate between several actors that may be good at several parts of the value chain, there is a lot to be done. That even though this is also explored and you see all kinds of interesting initiatives, there is still a lot to be done to do this better, and also then have fitting resourcing and perhaps also dynamic plans about resourcing of this kind of development and deployment of these services. There's still a lot to be won there. Of course, there are all kinds of data issues still, and I would like to emphasize, because a part of the downstream climate services definitely need also extensive non-climate data. So these should open up as well. You should, as was shown in the previous presentation, in fact, so the combination of climate and non-climate data is partly producing a big part of the value added. And that means that the connecting that and opening up that kind of data and standardizing, etc., is also really important. And relatively, that has, even though there's still much to be wished, also perhaps on climate data, even though, of course, thanks to Copernicus, a lot has been won already, and you see that's already relatively ahead. But this non-climate data, there is still much more to be won there. It's much more dispersed and less standardized, etc. And in fact, due to these previous points, it means there is lack of oversight and transparency, in fact, both at the supply and the demand side. So developers of products may partly not know all their potential type of customers. On the other hand, potential customers may not know exactly what would be all the relevant alternative suppliers that they could have. Of course, you find something, but that whole process, that matching process, could also still be helped. So then we formulated sets of recommendations. Of course, the first one is logic, given what I just said. Then we should come to a systematic set of regulations on mandatory climate risk reporting and transparency. And also, to some extent, it may mean that you have to say something about accountability in relation to this in several sectors, especially the key sectors that I just mentioned. And this is also a message, in fact, to the EU as a funder of this kind of studies and pilots, etc. But ever so much also other funding organizations. So it's important to enable insight and support collaboration between these different type of actors, but also then in a systematic way try to monitor how that is working and why it's not working, and what are the understanding the market conditions, regulatory conditions under which a certain model may work or not work so much. And also take care of this public-private divide, which is in some countries a bigger problem than in other countries, to work smoothly together. In fact, brokerage and marketplaces that there are a few now around, like OSS Hub is probably known by many of you, that may also still help to promote this as well. And in that, indeed, sort of what you also see, what we found in EU marks, that there have been really interesting sort of potentially successful products, but when they went out of the pilot phase, then they sort of not really took off. And that had to do with the business and resourcing models that were not thought through after you have had this pilot phase. So there should be much more thinking still also about that. Because, for example, EU projects may look into pilots, but they may not look into what is happening after the pilot, or at least not enough. Perhaps in due course, I could also mention indeed one of the things that is not mentioned here separately, but that would indeed be really valuable if providers and perhaps also national authorities could understand better what is actually the value of different services. How does this value production look like? What are the benefits, the net benefits of these services? And to whom these benefits in fact accrue, etc. And under what conditions do you have net benefits, and under what conditions these benefits drop to zero again. So other things indeed is promoting of standardization in several ways. And then because of this lack of transparency, something like a market observatory, for example, in energy efficiency policy areas, that kind of observatories also exists. Of course, again, pursue open and affordable data policies and the practice of it in all EU member states, because that still varies across member states. Also, again, I emphasize for non-climate data. And finally, foster innovation in climate services, but across the whole value chain. Of course, we still need upstream, still accuracy of forecasts to improve that remains important. But relatively, I would dare to say that there should be more emphasis what is happening midstream and downstream in these systems. So the other elements in the climate services need relatively a bit more emphasis to boost the uptake. And for that, you need indeed also a variety of experts from different disciplines, and also experts that are more experts from a practice point of view and not academic. Thank you very much. These were my messages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and to point us to lots of practical sort of issues that we need to consider as we move forward. And I also like to give a big thank you to all the presenters who was trying to point us to the right direction, shining a light on the value add of the seasonal forecast and climate services. That's brilliant, and it was worth listening to different perspectives.